Chapter 1: The Americas Before the Europeans, a World of Flourishing Civilizations. The Americas, before the arrival of Europeans, were filled with incredibly rich, diverse, and advanced civilizations. These peoples had developed languages, technologies, and complex social structures that were unique to the land they inhabited. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations, as well as many others, were centers of incredible culture, innovation, and art. The Maya civilization, builders of the past and the astronomers of the heavens. The Maya civilization, flourishing between 250 CE and 900 CE, had one of the most advanced societies in the Americas, with remarkable achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. The Maya were particularly known for their ability to predict celestial events with great precision. Their calendar systems, the Hab, solar calendar, and the Tzolk'in ritual calendar, were based on their observations of the stars and planets. The Maya made accurate calculations of the length of the year and developed a concept of zero, which was revolutionary at the time. They were also masters of the art of writing, employing a system of hieroglyphic symbols to record their history and royal lineages. The Maya were also skilled architects and engineers, building vast stone cities with towering pyramids, palaces, and observatories. Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul were among their greatest cities, with structures like the Temple of the Giant Jaguar at Tikal soaring high above the jungle canopy. These cities were built in harmony with the natural landscape, often situated near rivers, which helped facilitate trade and transportation. Water management was a critical feature of Maya cities, where they developed advanced irrigation systems and reservoirs, which allowed them to sustain their populations in the challenging tropical environment. The Maya religion was deeply intertwined with their understanding of the cosmos, and their ceremonial rituals reflected their belief in the need to appease the gods through offerings, sacrifices, and festivals. The Maya believed that the gods controlled the movements of the stars and that human life was subject to their whims. The ball game, an important ritual in Maya society, symbolized the cosmic battle between day and night, and it was often associated with human sacrifice. However, despite their achievements, the Maya civilization faced several challenges that contributed to its decline. By the 9th century, many southern cities began to experience droughts, overpopulation, and resource depletion, leading to social unrest and the eventual abandonment of key urban centers. Despite these declines, the Maya persisted in the northern cities, like Chichen Itza, which continued to thrive until the arrival of the Spanish centuries later. The Aztec Empire, lords of the Valley of Mexico. The Aztec Empire, or Mexica Empire, which flourished between 1428 CE and 1521 CE, was one of the most powerful and complex civilizations in the Americas. Unlike the Maya, whose civilization had experienced a slow decline, the Aztecs rose to prominence through military conquest and the strategic acquisition of resources and territory. The Mexica people, originally nomadic, settled in the Valley of Mexico after seeing an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, which they took as a divine sign. This vision led them to establish their city of Tenochtitlan, which would become one of the largest and most awe-inspiring cities in the world. At its height, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering, built on a series of small islands in Lake Texcoco. The city was connected to the mainland by a system of causeways and bridges, and its canals allowed for efficient transportation and trade. The Aztecs built massive pyramids, including the Templo Mayor, dedicated to their gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The Aztec military was feared throughout Mesoamerica, and they conducted wars of conquest, known as the Flower Wars, to capture prisoners for human sacrifice. The Aztec army used a combination of highly skilled warriors, elite troops, and the use of tactics to intimidate their enemies. The Aztec religion was integral to their society. It centered on the worship of many gods, including Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. Human sacrifice was seen as a necessary offering to the gods to ensure the continuation of the world and the movement of the sun. These sacrifices were performed on the Templo Mayor, where victims were often placed on an altar and their hearts were removed while they were still alive, a gruesome practice that stunned the European observers. However, Despite their military prowess and cultural achievements, the Aztec Empire was vulnerable to the forces of nature, disease, and internal strife. The arrival of Hernán Cortés in 1519 would prove to be the beginning of the empire's downfall. The Inca Empire, masters of the Andean Mountains. The Inca Empire, which spanned from 1438 CE to 1533 CE, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. Centered in the Andean highlands of Peru, the Incas managed to unite a diverse and sprawling region of mountains, valleys, and plateaus. The Incas were able to govern this vast empire through a highly efficient system of roads, MITA, labor tax, and a centralized state. The Capac Nan, an extensive road network, allowed for rapid movement of goods, people, and military forces across the empire. This system enabled the Inca emperor to control a territory that stretched from Ecuador to Chile, encompassing a wide range of climates and peoples. The Inca capital, Cusco, was known as the navel of the world, and it was home to the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered the divine son of the sun god Inti. The Incas were adept farmers, developing techniques like terracing to farm the steep mountain slopes, and they had extensive irrigation systems that allowed them to cultivate crops like potatoes, maize, and quinoa. They also had an advanced knowledge of metallurgy and textile production. The Incas were skilled engineers and built impressive structures such as Machu Picchu, a royal estate set high in the Andes, which has become a symbol of Incan civilization. The Incas practiced a unique form of socialism, where land and labor were managed by the state to ensure that the needs of the people were met. The Inca religion was centered around the worship of Inti, the sun god, and Pachamama, the earth goddess. The Incas believed in the spiritual connection between the land and the people, and they honored this relationship through elaborate ceremonies and rituals. The Inca Empire faced internal strife, especially after the death of Sapa Inca Huayna Capac in 1525, which led to a civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huáscar. This conflict weakened the empire and left it vulnerable to external threats. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, arrived and captured Atahualpa, bringing the empire to its knees. The Spanish conquest was facilitated not only by superior weaponry but also by the spread of diseases, particularly smallpox, which decimated the Inca population and further destabilized the empire. Chapter 2. The Arrival of Europeans, Columbus, the Conquistadors, and the First Encounters, 1492 to 1521. The beginning of European exploration and the Voyage of Columbus, 1492. In 1492, the European world was in the midst of a renaissance, and the thirst for exploration was growing. Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator born in Genoa, proposed a plan to find a new sea route to Asia by sailing westward, aiming to establish direct trade with the rich markets of the East. Columbus believed that by sailing west from Spain, he would find a shortcut to the lucrative spice trade. However, his proposal was met with skepticism from many European powers, as many considered the journey impractical. After being rejected by both Portugal and France, Columbus found support from the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, who saw Columbus's plan as a potential means to increase Spain's influence and wealth. In August 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, on his historic journey. On October 12, 1492, Columbus and his crew made landfall on an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Believing he had reached the East Indies, he called the native inhabitants Indians. In truth, Columbus had arrived in the Caribbean, part of what we now know as the New World. Columbus made subsequent voyages to the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, encountering several indigenous tribes, most notably the Taino people, whom he described as friendly and open. He noted their apparent lack of weaponry and their naivety, which would later contribute to their downfall. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of a period of intense European exploration and colonization in the Americas. His journals and letters describing the land's potential and the native people's subjugation prompted further expeditions from Spain and other European nations. The Taino people, who numbered in the millions before the arrival of Columbus, were soon subjected to exploitation and forced labor, creating the foundation for centuries of colonial brutality. The establishment of Spanish colonies, 1493 to 1521. Following Columbus's discovery, Spain's interest in the Caribbean and the wider New World grew exponentially. The Spanish crown saw the Americas as a resource-rich territory that could provide immense wealth, especially through the extraction of gold and silver. In 1493, Columbus returned to Spain to report his findings, and in 1496, he was given permission to establish the first permanent Spanish colony in the Americas, Isabela, in present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This marked the beginning of Spanish colonization, which would eventually stretch across much of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Spanish colonization was marked by the introduction of the encomienda system, a practice that granted Spanish settlers and soldiers the right to extract forced labor and tribute from indigenous populations in exchange for protection and the promise to convert them to Christianity. This system, although presented as a means of mutual benefit, quickly descended into a brutal form of slavery, where native people were exploited for their labor in the extraction of precious metals, agricultural goods, and other resources. The Taino and other indigenous groups were subjected to forced labor on plantations, in mines, and in construction projects, with many dying from overwork, disease, and maltreatment. At the same time, the Spanish missions began to spread throughout the Caribbean and mainland Americas, aiming to convert native populations to Christianity. Spanish missionaries, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, established missions in which native people were taught European customs and forced to abandon their traditional beliefs and ways of life. The conversion of the native peoples, however, was often done through coercion and force rather than through the peaceful propagation of religious faith. The rapid spread of diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought by the Europeans, devastated native populations who had no immunity to such illnesses. In some cases, entire tribes and cultures were wiped out, as diseases spread faster than European settlers could conquer and subjugate. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America were lost within a few decades due to disease, warfare, and exploitation. Hernán Cortés and the fall of the Aztec Empire, 1519 to 1521. One of the most significant and destructive conquests in the history of the Americas was that of the Aztec Empire. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador, set out to explore the Yucatan Peninsula and eventually made his way into the heart of the Aztec Empire, which ruled much of present-day Mexico. Cortés, unlike other explorers, was an ambitious leader who sought to conquer and claim new lands for Spain. Upon arriving in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, Cortés was initially welcomed by the Aztec Emperor, Montezuma II. Montezuma believed Cortés might be the god Quetzalcoatl returning as prophesied, and he treated him with deference and presented him with rich gifts. However, Cortés quickly turned the situation to his advantage, exploiting Montezuma's hospitality while secretly plotting the downfall of the Aztecs. The Spanish were greatly aided by disease, particularly smallpox, which ravaged the Aztec population. The virus spread quickly among the indigenous peoples, killing tens of thousands. Cortés also forged alliances with native enemies of the Aztecs, notably the Tlaxcalans, who had long been subjugated by the Aztec Empire. These alliances provided Cortés with additional troops and resources for his siege of Tenochtitlan. By 1521, after months of brutal warfare, starvation, and disease, Cortés's forces laid waste to Tenochtitlan. The fall of the Aztec Empire marked a pivotal moment in the European conquest of the Americas. Cortés claimed vast territories for Spain, establishing a permanent presence in the heart of what is now Mexico. Francisco Pizarro and the Inca Conquest, 1532 to 1533. In 1532, another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, set his sights on the Inca Empire in the Andes. The Incas were at the height of their power when Pizarro arrived, with their capital at Cusco in Peru. However, The Inca Empire was weakened by a civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother Huascar, who fought for the throne after the death of the former emperor, Huayna Capac. Pizarro, taking advantage of the Inca instability, captured Atahualpa in 1532 during a meeting. Despite offering a vast ransom of gold and silver for his release, Pizarro executed Atahualpa, and the Inca capital fell soon after. The conquest of the Inca Empire, like that of the Aztecs, was facilitated by the devastating effects of European diseases and the technological. Chapter 3. The Spanish Empire. Subjugation, Conversion, and Cultural Erasure, 1521–1600s. The rise of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, 1521 to 1600. Following the dramatic conquests of the Aztec Empire in 1521 and the Inca Empire in 1532, Spain solidified its position as the dominant European power in the Americas. The Spanish crown quickly sought to capitalize on its newfound wealth, mainly derived from precious metals like gold and silver, extracted from the conquered territories. The extensive mining operations in regions such as Mexico and Peru became central to the Spanish economy. The Potosí silver mine in present-day Bolivia was one of the richest sources of silver in the world, and its wealth contributed significantly to the global economy, making Spain one of the most powerful empires of the time. In addition to their control over resources, the Spanish sought to impose their religion, language, and culture on the indigenous populations. The Spanish crown and the Catholic Church collaborated closely, aiming to bring Christianity to the New World and convert the native peoples to European customs. This period, marked by intense missionary efforts, saw the widespread spread of Catholicism, which had far-reaching consequences for indigenous religions and traditions. Spanish missionaries, especially the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, played a pivotal role in the conversion of indigenous peoples. They established missions across the Americas, ranging from California in the north to Argentina in the south. These missions were not simply religious outposts, but also centers for cultural assimilation and European-style agriculture. The Spanish sought to teach the indigenous peoples European farming techniques, often forcing them to abandon their traditional ways of subsistence agriculture in favor of cultivating European crops, such as wheat, corn, and sugarcane. The missionary system often involved forced labor and strict surveillance of the indigenous people. In many cases, entire communities were coerced into abandoning their native languages, religious practices, and cultural norms. Indigenous spirituality, which had been deeply tied to the natural world and the worship of ancestors, was viewed as pagan and was actively suppressed by the Spanish missionaries. Indigenous religious structures, including temples and shrines, were destroyed or repurposed for Catholic rituals. These efforts were part of a broader mission to civilize and convert the native peoples to European standards of behavior and belief. The encomienda system and forced labor. At the core of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas was the encomienda system, a legal framework established by the Spanish crown. This system granted Spanish settlers, known as encomenderos, the right to extract labor and tribute from the native populations in exchange for offering protection and Christian instruction. Essentially, the encomienda system allowed the Spanish to enslave the indigenous peoples under the guise of benevolent guardianship. While the encomienda system was initially designed to provide protection to indigenous communities, in practice it became a system of forced labor that caused immeasurable suffering. The encomenderos were responsible for the well-being of the indigenous people they controlled, but in many cases, they exploited the system to an extreme, forcing native workers into brutal and grueling conditions, particularly in the mining and agriculture sectors. One of the most notorious aspects of this exploitation was the treatment of indigenous workers in the silver mines of Potosí. Thousands of indigenous men and boys were forced into the mines, where they labored in dangerous, unhealthy conditions. The toxic fumes of mercury, the suffocating heat, and the dangerous working conditions led to high mortality rates. Entire generations of indigenous peoples perished in the mines, their deaths a direct result of the Spanish thirst for wealth. The Spanish crown initially implemented reforms, such as the new laws of 1542, to reduce the worst abuses of the encomienda system. However, The system largely remained intact for much of the colonial period, as both the Crown and the settlers depended on the exploitation of native labor to maintain their economic interests. The gradual shift towards African slavery also played a significant role in alleviating the pressure on indigenous populations, though it would bring its own form of racial oppression and exploitation that would continue throughout the colonial era. The impact of disease and the decimation of indigenous populations. One of the most devastating consequences of European colonization was the introduction of diseases to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. Before the arrival of Europeans, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had lived in relative isolation from the diseases that ravaged Europe, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases, along with the common cold and typhus, spread rapidly among native populations who lacked any form of immunity. Smallpox was particularly deadly. It is believed that smallpox and other diseases killed up to 90% of the indigenous population in the first century after European contact. This demographic collapse had far-reaching consequences, not only decimating entire communities, but also undermining native social structures, economies, and cultures. As populations plummeted, native groups found it increasingly difficult to resist European encroachments on their land and their way of life. In regions like the Caribbean, where the first encounters took place, entire populations were wiped out. The Taino people, who Columbus first encountered, were among the first to suffer this fate. The Carib and Arawak peoples also experienced catastrophic population losses. In the years following Columbus's arrival, these populations were effectively extinguished, and the Spanish looked to Africa for enslaved labor to replace the native workforce. The cultural erasure and forced assimilation of native peoples. As Spanish colonization expanded, so too did the cultural erasure of indigenous peoples. The Spanish imposed their language, religion, and customs upon the native populations, viewing indigenous cultures as inferior and barbaric. Catholicism was not only a tool for spiritual conversion, but also a means of cultural control. Native religious ceremonies, which were an integral part of indigenous life, were banned or hidden, and native spiritual leaders were often persecuted. Many indigenous religions were supplanted by Catholic rituals, though some native practices continued in secret. The Catholic missionaries in the Americas did not just aim to convert, they sought to reshape the entire worldview of indigenous peoples. They believed that the indigenous peoples were savage and needed to be civilized. They introduced European education systems, European agricultural practices, and even European forms of family structure. In some cases, native children were sent to mission schools, where they were stripped of their traditional clothing, forced to adopt European names, and taught to read and write in Spanish. The Spanish also sought to physically erase indigenous cultures by destroying artifacts, temples, and other cultural symbols. Many pre-Columbian ruins were deliberately obliterated or repurposed by the Spanish. In places like Mexico and Peru, Aztec and Inca cities were either razed or converted into Spanish-style towns, complete with churches and plazas. The creation of missions also had the effect of centralizing indigenous populations, breaking up traditional communities and further disempowering native peoples. In these settlements, native populations were forced to live under Spanish supervision and were subject to European-style governance. Some of the traditional forms of native self-governance and social structure were deliberately undermined, leading to a loss of cultural autonomy and power. Resistance and rebellions. Despite the overwhelming power of the Spanish, there were instances of resistance from indigenous peoples throughout the colonial period. Some native groups sought to maintain their independence, leading to uprisings and rebellions. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in what is now New Mexico is one of the most notable examples. The Pueblo people, who had been subjected to brutal missionary efforts and forced labor, managed to unite under the leadership of Pope, a Pueblo religious leader, to expel the Spanish from their territories for a time. The revolt successfully drove the Spanish from New Mexico for over a decade, although the Spanish ultimately returned, and the cycle of exploitation and cultural suppression continued. Other instances of resistance were less successful, but no less significant. The history of Spanish colonization in the Americas is one of immense brutality and cultural devastation, but also one of resilience and resistance from indigenous peoples who fought to retain their autonomy, spirituality, and way of life. Conclusion: the legacy of Spanish colonization. By the end of the 16th century, the Spanish Empire had firmly established its dominion over vast territories in the Americas, including much of modern-day Mexico, Central America, and large parts of South America. The legacy of Spanish colonization is one marked by profound cultural destruction, demographic collapse, and exploitation, but also by the blending of European and indigenous cultures in certain areas. While the Spanish sought to impose their dominance and erase indigenous traditions, they inadvertently set the stage for the development of a mestizo, mixed race, culture that would define much of Latin America in the centuries to come. The Catholic Church's role in spreading Christianity was integral to the shaping of new identities, and the language and customs of the Spanish settlers left an indelible mark on the Americas. However, the exploitation of indigenous peoples, the ravages of disease, and the constant conflict with settlers left a dark legacy that would continue into the modern era, influencing the development of the Americas in complex ways. The Spanish had brought wealth, Christianity, and European culture to the New World, but at an immense cost to the native peoples who were forced to bear the brunt of this ambitious and often destructive colonial enterprise. Post-1600, the complex web of European colonization, Native American resistance, and the rise of transatlantic slavery. The rise of European empires in the New World, 1600 to 1700. By the turn of the 17th century, the Americas were on the cusp of experiencing profound change as European powers sought to expand their influence across the continents. European explorers had already set foot in the Americas by the early 1500s, with the Spanish establishing control over vast territories in the south, the Portuguese seeking trade routes, and the French exploring the St. Lawrence River and Mississippi River regions. But by 1600, colonization was accelerating as Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands all vied for control. Spanish dominance and cultural assimilation, 1600s. The Spanish Empire, which had conquered large portions of Mexico, Central America, and South America, was firmly entrenched in the Americas by the early 17th century. Spain's colonies became central to its wealth, primarily because of their vast mineral resources. Silver from mines like Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia, and gold extracted from indigenous labor were foundational to Spain's global empire. Spanish rule was cemented through the use of the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to extract forced labor from indigenous populations, primarily for mining, agriculture, and construction. However, the native populations were decimated not only by forced labor but also by European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. It is estimated that within a few decades of European contact, the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90%. This devastating decline resulted in Spain's reliance on African slaves to fill the labor gap. The transatlantic slave trade, which began on a large scale in the early 1500s, exploded in the 17th century as African slaves were forcibly brought to work on Spanish sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. Despite the brutal methods employed by the Spanish in maintaining control, they also introduced Christianity to the native peoples. Catholic missionaries, including the Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans, built churches, schools, and missions throughout the Spanish Americas. These religious efforts were often intertwined with Spanish colonial agendas, aiming to integrate indigenous peoples into European religious practices and suppress native belief systems. Despite this, many indigenous groups resisted the Spanish presence in their lands, often leading to uprisings and revolts, such as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, in which Pueblo Native Americans expelled Spanish colonists from modern-day New Mexico. The French approach, trade, alliance, and adaptation, 1600s to 1700s. Unlike the Spanish, the French colonization strategy centered more on trade than territorial conquest. By 1608, the French had established Quebec, one of the first permanent settlements in New France. Samuel de Champlain, the founder of Quebec, was primarily focused on developing a fur trading network, especially with indigenous groups like the Hurons, Algonquins, and Ottawas. This led to relatively peaceful and cooperative relations with the indigenous tribes, who were seen as essential partners in the fur trade. The French understood the importance of native diplomacy and cultural exchange. While they brought Catholic missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, to convert the indigenous people, the French were less aggressive than the Spanish in imposing their religion and culture. The French were also less interested in establishing large-scale agricultural settlements, which allowed them to coexist more harmoniously with indigenous tribes. This diplomatic approach helped build alliances, particularly with the Hurons and Algonquins, who sought French assistance in their long-standing conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy. However, the French approach was not without its complications. The Iroquois, who initially tried to ally with the French, later turned hostile due to competition over fur trade and territory. The French and Iroquois wars in the 17th century were particularly brutal, with the French seeking to defend their settlements and trading networks. The Iroquois Confederacy eventually aligned with the British during the French and Indian War in the mid-1700s. The fur trade economy and relatively smaller French settler population allowed the French colonies to grow more slowly compared to English colonies. Nonetheless, their strategic alliances with indigenous groups played a crucial role in maintaining French interests in North America. By the end of the 17th century, however, British colonial expansion began to outpace French efforts, leading to a series of military confrontations between the two colonial powers. The English colonies, expansion, displacement, and conflict 1600s to 1700s. The English, on the other hand, pursued a very different model of colonization. The founding of Jamestown in 1607 was the first permanent English settlement in North America. The English settlers came with a dual purpose. They sought wealth through agriculture, especially tobacco, and also desired to escape the religious persecution they faced in England. Unlike the French and Spanish, English colonists actively sought to settle on and cultivate the land. This aggressive expansion into indigenous territories led to inevitable conflicts. The relationship between the English settlers and indigenous groups was marked by both cooperation and violent clashes. Early on, the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Powhatan and later his daughter Pocahontas, initially aided the English, teaching them agricultural practices and helping them survive. However, as the English population grew, their hunger for land increased, leading to a series of wars and skirmishes with the Powhatans and other native groups. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609 to 1614, and the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, 1622 to 1632, were particularly bloody, with the Powhatans fighting to preserve their land and way of life. The English colonies were built on a system of land grants and plantations. As settlers began to encroach on indigenous lands, native peoples were pushed westward and were often subjected to violent displacement. In the Virginia colony, the rise of tobacco as the primary cash crop led to the widespread establishment of plantations, which required an ever-growing labor force. At first, English settlers relied on indentured servants, who worked the land for a set period of time in exchange for passage to the Americas, but as the demand for labor soared, planters began to look to Africa. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, where they were initially classified as indentured servants. However, over time, racist ideologies began to take root, and slavery became institutionalized. The growth of the transatlantic slave trade saw the forced importation of African slaves to the American colonies. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, slavery became the cornerstone of the Southern economy, with enslaved Africans working on tobacco, rice, and later cotton plants. As the English colonies expanded, conflict with indigenous tribes escalated. The Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, the King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, and the Tuscarora War, 1711 to 1715, were significant military confrontations between English settlers and indigenous groups. The Pequot War, in particular, was one of the bloodiest early conflicts, with the English and their Native American allies attacking the Pequot tribe, resulting in the massacre of hundreds of Pequots and their near-total destruction. The rise of African slavery and its impact on indigenous populations, 1600s to 1700s. The growth of slavery in the English colonies had profound consequences for both indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. As the English established a system of labor that depended on African slaves, the social dynamics in the colonies began to change. African slaves were treated as property, forced into hard labor on plantations, and subjected to brutal violence. Simultaneously, the Atlantic slave trade continued to grow in scope and scale. Slavery was not just an economic system but a cultural institution that redefined racial identities. The impact on Native Americans was equally severe, as the expansion of European colonization created increasing pressure on indigenous groups. By the late 17th century, many indigenous tribes were caught in the crossfire between the European settlers and each other, often drawn into European-led conflicts. The forced migration of enslaved Africans further disrupted traditional social structures in both the African and Native American communities. African slaves, while often forced into labor on plantations, formed their own communities and cultures within the context of slavery. Their cultural resilience, as well as their resistance to slavery, would play a crucial role in shaping future rebellions and resistance movements. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, was one of the most critical conflicts in shaping the future of North America. The war, which took place between 1754 and 1763, was fought between the French and their indigenous allies on one side and the British and their Iroquois allies on the other. The war was fought over territorial disputes in the Ohio River Valley and the larger struggle for dominance over North America. The Iroquois Confederacy was a key player in the war, aligning with the British to protect their interests against French encroachment. The French, on the other hand, relied on alliances with various tribes such as the Hurons, Algonquins, and others, who feared British colonial expansion. The war was brutal, and Native American groups found themselves trapped between two warring European powers. In the aftermath of the war, the Treaty of Paris, 1763, dramatically altered the geopolitical landscape of North America. France ceded its vast territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, and Spain ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for control over Louisiana. The British victory was a double-edged sword for the indigenous peoples, as it opened the door for greater colonial expansion. The long-term impact on Native American populations, 1600s to 1800s. The centuries of European colonization in the Americas were marked by continuous upheaval for indigenous populations. By the mid-1700s, Native American societies were deeply transformed. Population losses due to disease, displacement, warfare, and slavery took a devastating toll. Indigenous ways of life were disrupted, and many tribes were displaced from their ancestral homelands. The influx of European settlers, the rise of plantation economies, and the increasing demands of the transatlantic slave trade permanently reshaped the demographic and cultural fabric of the Americas. While some indigenous groups managed to resist or forge alliances with European powers, others were overwhelmed by the relentless forces of colonization, leading to their near extinction or forced relocation to reservations. The legacy of this period is still evident in the ongoing struggles of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The forced assimilation, land dispossession, and systemic racism they faced from European powers created historical injustices that persist in the modern era. Independence movements and aftermath, the struggle for sovereignty and the emergence of new nations. The dawn of rebellion and revolution, late 18th century, early 19th century. By the late 1700s, the Americas were caught in a wave of political, social, and economic change. Colonial powers like Spain, France, and Britain had long established dominion over vast territories in the Americas. However, the increasingly strict governance and economic exploitation of the colonies, as well as the broader Enlightenment ideas sweeping through Europe and the North American colonies, laid the foundation for widespread rebellion. The revolutions in North America and France significantly influenced the colonists in the Americas, and by the early 19th century, the stage was set for a series of independence movements across the continent. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The American Revolution was not just a struggle for the independence of the 13 British colonies in North America, but also a symbolic starting point for the other American colonies who sought freedom from colonial rule. Colonial America had been largely left to its own devices in the early years, but as Britain began imposing more taxes to pay off the debts of its wars, including the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, tensions grew. The Stamp Act 1765, Townshend Acts 1767, and Tea Act 1773 were seen as unjust taxes as the colonies had no representation in the British Parliament. This led to uprisings and protests, most famously the Boston Tea Party, 1773, where American colonists, dressed as Native Americans, dumped 342 chests of British tea into the harbor in protest of the tea tax. The rebellion escalated into full-scale warfare in 1775, with the first shots fired at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Under the leadership of George Washington, and aided by the French, who entered the war in 1778 following the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, the Continental Army managed to outlast British forces. The Siege of Yorktown, 1781, marked the turning point of the war, with the surrender of British General Cornwallis effectively ending the conflict. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States and granted it control over a vast expanse of land. The newly independent country now faced the challenge of organizing itself under the Constitution adopted in 1787, creating a democratic system of government and securing individual rights through the Bill of Rights in 1791. The success of the American Revolution had far-reaching consequences, influencing other colonial territories in Europe's empires to take up the cause of independence. The Revolution was an embodiment of the ideals of freedom and democracy and set a precedent that would resonate across the Atlantic for decades to come. The French Revolution, 1789, and its global impact. The French Revolution, 1789, played a significant role in shaping the revolutionary movements in the Americas. France, like Britain, had long oppressed its colonies and its own people, taxing them heavily to fund wars and lavish court expenditures. By the time of the French Revolution, the monarchy was bankrupt, and the lower classes were suffering from severe poverty and famine. In the face of these pressures, the French people, led by a revolutionary movement that sought to overthrow the absolute monarchy, issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. The French Revolution was not just a political upheaval but also a societal one, aiming to dismantle the old feudal and aristocratic structures. The revolution in France, with its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, deeply influenced colonial societies, especially in the Caribbean. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, would become the focal point of the first successful slave rebellion as enslaved Africans, inspired by the French Revolution's promises of equality and freedom, rose up. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. In Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791 when the enslaved people, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, revolted against the French colonial authorities. Louverture, a former slave, became the leader of the rebellion and skillfully navigated alliances with the Spanish and later the French, even negotiating with Napoleon's forces. After years of intense fighting, which included the intervention of both British and Spanish forces, the revolutionaries successfully defeated the French army. In 1804, Haiti became the first independent Black republic in the world and the first country in the Americas to abolish slavery. This victory sent shockwaves throughout the world, particularly in the slave-owning colonies of the Caribbean and the Americas. Haiti's independence was a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples, but also a challenge to colonial powers who feared similar uprisings. It served as a testament to the potential power of enslaved peoples to overthrow their oppressors and reshape the world. The Latin American Revolutions, 1808 to 1826. While the French Revolution inspired slave uprisings, it also acted as a catalyst for the independence movements throughout the Spanish colonies in the Americas. In the early 1800s, Spain was struggling with internal issues, including the Napoleonic Wars, which forced King Ferdinand VII to abdicate the throne and led to the invasion of Spain by Napoleonic forces. The Spanish monarchy's instability allowed for the rise of nationalist movements within Spanish America. The rise of revolutionary leaders. The Latin American revolutions were complex and multifaceted, with different regions and leaders pursuing various goals. Simón Bolívar, a Venezuelan military and political leader, was one of the most prominent figures of these movements. Bolívar was a proponent of a united Latin America, which he envisioned as the Republic of Gran Colombia, comprising Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. Bolívar's forces defeated the Spanish in the Battle of Boyaca, 1819, leading to the creation of Gran Colombia. Meanwhile, José de San Martín, another key revolutionary leader, led the struggle for independence in the southern part of the continent, particularly in Argentina, Chile, and Peru. San Martín's forces won crucial victories, including the Battle of Maipú, 1818, which paved the way for independence in Chile and Argentina. In Mexico, the struggle for independence began in 1810, when Miguel Hidalgo, a Catholic priest, issued the Grito de Dolores, calling for the abolition of slavery and the end of Spanish rule. Despite being captured and executed, the revolution was continued by other leaders like José María Morelos and Vicente Guerrero. Mexico would not achieve full independence until 1821 after Agustín de Iturbide declared independence and led a successful campaign against Spanish forces. The Spanish Empire's collapse. Over the next 15 years, the Spanish Empire's grip on its colonies began to weaken. The Mexican War of Independence, the Wars of Independence in Colombia, and the Battle of Ayacucho, 1824, which ended Spanish rule in South America, were all key events that marked the collapse of Spanish authority. By 1826, all of Spain's major colonies had gained their independence, except for Cuba and Puerto Rico, which remained under Spanish control until later in the 19th century. The Latin American independence movements were deeply influenced by Enlightenment principles, but also shaped by local realities, including the legacies of colonial caste systems and the presence of indigenous populations. The revolutions were not just political, but social upheavals, leading to power struggles between former Creole elites, the descendants of Europeans, and the indigenous and mestizo populations. The aftermath of independence, challenges of nation-building. Post-independence, political instability. After the revolutions, many newly formed nations in the Americas faced intense challenges in their efforts to establish stable, functional governments. The unification of diverse ethnic groups, along with the establishment of republican institutions, was difficult in places like Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia, where civil wars and regional conflicts were common. The lack of strong institutions meant that in many countries, military leaders or caudillos, strongmen, rose to power. This era was marked by military dictatorships in many Latin American countries, and political instability became a significant theme. In Gran Colombia, for example, despite Bolívar's efforts to establish a united republic, the conflicts between regional powers and ideological divides led to the eventual dissolution of Gran Colombia in 1831 and the formation of separate nations, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The United States, having established its independence earlier, faced challenges of its own in maintaining unity. Issues of slavery. The expansion to the West and Native American removal led to internal strife, culminating in the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. This war between the northern states, the Union, and southern states, the Confederacy, over the issues of slavery and states' rights resulted in the abolition of slavery and the reunification of the United States. Economic and social struggles post-independence. The post-independence period was also economically difficult for the newly formed nations. Many countries were heavily indebted, and their economies were largely dependent on the export of raw materials to Europe and the United States. The agricultural systems that had been established under colonial rule remained intact, meaning that many nations continued to rely on slave labor or indentured laborers, especially in the Caribbean and parts of South America. In Mexico, after independence, there were significant efforts to redistribute land to the indigenous population, but the large landholding elites retained much of the land, leaving the peasantry in a difficult situation. In places like Argentina, the focus on export agriculture meant that land was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy landowners, leaving the majority of the population impoverished. U.S. expansion and its consequences. The United States, after achieving independence, began a policy of westward expansion, justified by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the U.S. was destined to expand across the North American continent. This expansion led to the forced removal of Native American populations and the settlement of territories that were previously inhabited by indigenous peoples. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forcibly relocated thousands of Native Americans, resulting in the tragic Trail of Tears in which thousands of Native Americans died during their forced relocation to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. This period of expansion also saw the annexation of territories such as Texas, 1845, which was previously part of Mexico, and the acquisition of California and other Western territories through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, following the Mexican-American War. The Monroe Doctrine and U.S. hegemony in the Americas. In 1823, U.S. President James Monroe introduced the Monroe Doctrine, which declared that European powers should not interfere in the Americas. This policy reflected the United States' growing dominance and desire to exert influence over the Western Hemisphere. While the Monroe Doctrine was initially aimed at preventing European colonization in the Americas, it was later used by the United States as a justification for intervening in Latin American affairs, particularly in the 20th century. The Long Road to Modernity. The story of independence and the aftermath is a long and tumultuous one. The creation of new nations from the ashes of colonial rule was not an easy task. It involved not only military struggles but also ideological, social, and economic transformations that took place over decades. While independence brought freedom from colonial powers, it also unleashed a cascade of new challenges, ranging from social inequality and racial tension to economic dependency and political instability. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Latin American nations and the United States would be at various stages of nation-building, with a mixture of democratic governance and authoritarian regimes, social reform movements, and continued colonial legacies that shaped much of their societies and politics. Certainly. Here's a thoughtful and fitting conclusion for your YouTube channel, Peaceful Stories, that aligns with the themes of the channel. As we reflect on the incredible journeys of the past, on the struggles, the triumphs, and the ongoing fight for justice and freedom, it's essential to remember that our stories, whether peaceful or turbulent, are the threads that weave the fabric of our shared humanity. History teaches us that while conflict may leave its marks, the resilience of those who seek peace, understanding, and compassion is what truly endures. Every story, no matter how small or large, has the power to illuminate paths toward a more peaceful future. At Peaceful Stories, we strive to shine a light on these stories, not only of history but of the lives, struggles, and moments that remind us of the importance of kindness, empathy, and hope. In the end, it's the peaceful actions, the quiet revolutions of compassion, that leave the most lasting impact on our world. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, reflecting, and sharing in these stories with us. Together, we can build a future where peace and understanding guide us toward a better tomorrow.